Every landscape is haunted by pathways of life, but they are also haunted by imaginary futures. As I stand on the banks of the Lachine Canal, contemplating its histories of mobility and contamination, colonial endeavors, and the concepts of nation and citizenship, I wonder at the radical historical contingencies that have led to the formation of this hybrid techno-environment, and perhaps more importantly, the conditions in which we might reimagine this place. What critical practices might allow for an articulation of our own situatedness in this unsettling, entangled place, and the potential for decolonizing our relationships with all that and those who compose place? The hauntings here on the Lachine Canal are not immaterial. Many reside in the 26 centimeters of toxic sludge that blankets the bed of the canal. The arsenic, mercury, copper, zinc, PCBs, lead, and other contaminants speak of this place's industrial past, policy decisions, and the internal problem of what to do with our waste. Anna Ching writes that we are products of a contaminated diversity, that as survivors of colonial greed, violence, and environmental destruction, we are co-constituted by the polluted, and this impurity, in Alexis Shotwell's words, hails us to make continually contingent and unsettled decisions about how to be in relation. How are we to be in relation to this hybrid techno-ecology that we call the Lachine Canal? I watch a lake sturgeon circle a small pool near the Côte St. Paul Lock on the canal on a mid-November afternoon. Its elongated body's armor, fins structured like sun rays, and the long tentacle-like barbels that search the bottom of the murky canal bottom seem of another time and world. And yet, here it is. The canal has been drained and this magnificent creature has been stranded. Later, I contact Parks Canada and a team goes out to net and transport the surgeon back into the St. Lawrence. But our encounter has shifted something in my thinking, in my being. Leroy Littlebear's observation that fish have been around from way before dinosaurs, before the Neanderthals, way before our time, seems particularly resonant when watching a sturgeon. Their evolution dates back to the Triassic period, some 245 million years ago. They are dinosaurs that have survived, living fossils. I wonder about their stories and thoughts and dreams. I also worry about their exposure to the long-living contaminants that mix and mingle with the shells, crustaceans, and small fish they feed on in the canal. I've read that sturgeon are particularly vulnerable to pollutants, and many species are classified as threatened or endangered. What harm are the residues of a past industrial age exacting now, and in the future of these fish? What are the future imaginaries of the lake sturgeon? Deborah Bird Rose describes the encounters among flying fish and flowering eucalyptus trees as shimmer, that the complex tangle and encounter of multi-species and their cascading effects in a landscape enact a more than human rhythm that shimmers. During the many hours I spend sitting on the bank of the canal, watching dogs and their humans as they stroll along the pathways, studying seagulls ever alert to the potential picnickers as they cruise the middle sky, the mallards paddling up and down the banks, and water beetles navigating the concrete canal walls. I watch for the shimmer of rhythms as they gather, oscillate, and dissipate, coming in and out of focus. But it was the rare glimpse of the sturgeon passing by like a ghost beneath the surface of the water that I felt the pulse of an ancient presence. Each encounter, however brief or removed, with the sturgeon was stirring in inexplicable ways, its prehistoric presence somehow interrupting my own rhythms and sense of time. Métis scholar Zoe Todd suggests the surface of the water bends and distorts the visibility of the fish worlds below the surface, and that we have to adapt our perceptions in order to commune with fish. She suggests that this refraction and concomitant action of dispersion have the potential to distort colonial framing of land and water, animals and fish, that in the strain to see and hear the fish is the potential to decenter the human, to allow for consideration of our complex relationships with fish and the more than human inhabitants of place. It is an opportunity to consider what Todd cites as our commitment to live well and with care across time and space in territories that have been ravaged by colonial violence. The temporal patterns that emerge from a more than human shimmering remind us that the world is composed of multifaceted and multi-species relationships and rhythms.
Our group first met Nick in late October of 2018. We had hoped to get some late season fishing in, but the canal was drained for the year. Our multi-species adventure would not be thwarted, though. He brought plastic baggies for us to collect samples from the mud, and we spent the day bearing the cold and exploring the plants and birds and bugs that still made their home there. We dug lots of things out of the mud, a lot of it trash or long-lost items, but we also encountered crayfish, some dead and also many alive. I couldn't help but wonder how they would survive in that frigid, contaminated mud all winter. These were the real canal locals. The humans, the fish, many of the birds, and even the water left in the wintertime. But these little folks would be here year-long, waiting for the city to let the water back in the spring.
April 8th was the day locks got reopened. It was symbolically the beginning of spring for the Lachine Canal, but the weather was still freezing cold. Some parts of the canal and river were still frozen. I was desperately looking for a hot drink, and when I couldn't find a place to get a drink, I started walking very fast, almost running. I thought to myself why the birds were back so early. The birds hadn't waited for the spring to move to Montreal. The birds and the plants seemed to welcome the spring together. The first thing came to my mind was that perhaps our understanding and sense of seasonality, the natural time course, the temperature, and the angle of sun's radiation had changed over time, being equipped for everything, every season, every climate.
Once summer came around and the canal was filled once again, we began fishing with Nick regularly. None of us, except for Nick, had engaged with the canal this way before, and from the moment I sat down with a rod next to the water, hidden away below low trees and behind bushes, it was a different space for me. On our first fishing trip, we stayed until the sun went down, and I marveled at seeing downtown Montreal framed by the sunset not too far away from where I was fishing, an activity I associated with romps in the wilderness. I hadn't rented a car to get there, and when I was done, it wouldn't take me long to get home. I suppose I could have seen the same sunset from a kayak on the water, but there was something about what I was doing there that made it different. I sat on the bank with a fishing rod in my hand, and with little to no control over what would happen. The fish controlled my experience there on the canal. I was on their time now.
These are my hands. They hold the body of the camera. My fingers adjust the aperture. One click to the left on the small textured wheel and the reading changes. Those are her hands. They grip tightly a thin plastic fishing wire. It is fed meticulously through the gaps between her fingers and then wrapped 1, 2, 3 times around her hand to allow for control and a tighter purchase. Some of the excess wire dangles below. She is guiding the wire as best she can through the water. I don't see the other end of it, but I know that it is attached to a weighted object somewhere deep below the surface. His hands are busy with the small fish one of us caught. We hadn't intended to kill it. We were only going to get a bite and then feed it back. But the hook of the fishing rod got stuck between its gills, and suddenly the fish was in pain and couldn't be saved. We had to kill it. He killed it. Or maybe she did. She watched to prove herself that she could. The fish had wide eyes and beat its tail against the rocks manically. These are his hands. He pierces the worm's body through the tip of the hook. He winds the wheel of the fishing rod so that the wire is pulled in. He casts a line. He repeats. These are his hands. They move in gentle gestures as he talks of the canal. These are my hands, soft, clean, untouched by the labor they engage in. She doesn't look away when they kill the fish, taking its pain endured away through one swift movement. I do. After, I touch its smooth scales, still wet, with my finger. Try to imagine its organs inside slowly shutting down. We're looking at the water, at the bank, at the reeds swaying with the ripples, at the occasional rubbish that floats by. We're trying to understand it, more than we would if we were to walk by one day.
Control is a funny thing there in the canal. While I fished, it felt like the fish were in charge, but if I scale back, it's easy to see how untrue that really is. Think of the sturgeon trapped in the October puddle. Humans control the movement of the fish not only seasonally, but on a shorter time frame too. Locks are opened and closed depending on the passage of boats, and in the meantime the fish are stuck in between. Really, these fish are just trying to get back to the river. Some of them do, some of them don't. And what an odd relationship we have with those that are trapped there with us. Ideally, fishing is to eat, but that's a complicated thing in the canal. There are people who eat the fish they catch in the canal. I suppose there are ways of knowing which ones are good to eat or not, but I have to say that being so close to the water, beautiful as the scenery was, did not make the fish look appetizing. Nick fishes in the canal because he loves to fish. Not unlike the other recreational activities that people partake in there, this is mostly for fun, for enjoyment. This fact makes the experience trickier, ethically speaking. When fishing with Nick, I was lucky enough to catch a little perch more than a few times, but as an inexperienced fisher, that sometimes resulted in the death of the fish. My first perch swallowed the hook and died. We ended up using it as bait for bigger fish, which made me feel better because at least it was re-entering the life cycle. Still, I could not deny that in a space where eating the animal isn't an option, I was there using them for sport. Even the fish I didn't kill and threw back in, I still had put through an entire painful, traumatic ordeal. For what?
When I returned to the canal about a month later, on a weekday morning, many things had changed. The weather had gotten warmer, the air had gotten more humid, and the trees and grass had turned green. What caught my attention the most was the birds. Last time the visible ones, were mainly flying in the air or hunting in the water, but this time many were strutting on the ground. The birds I saw in April were mainly water birds, such as ducks and geese. But when I returned to the canal in May, the presence of non-aquatic birds, such as red-winged blackbirds, was strong. Even ducks and geese were rummaging the soil for food. With the rise in temperature, the interconnection of birds and soil seemed to become more pronounced.
In May of 2019, I spent a week in Copenhagen watching a berm full of rainbow-colored wildflowers bloom and wilt. Almost every day for a week, I made a map of that berm. At first, it was just this chaotic green tangle of indistinguishable lives. It was complete chaos. But I sat there for long enough that eventually individuals started to come out, and I started to anchor my perception of that berm's change over time to those couple of plants. Soon I could distinguish the foliage of different clovers and tell apart the 3 different grasses. It felt to me like I was parsing a chaos, like I was listening deeply to an urban microbiome that other people were probably ignoring. Later that summer, I did the same thing, but larger, along a part of the Lachine Canal in Montreal. I wanted to observe changes in the ecosystem over the season, like a large-scale version of what I'd done in Copenhagen. I documented my trip using my cell phone, taking videos and photos from the same few spots at the same few plants every time. After the first couple of visits, there was a mullein and a chicory and a mugwort and a fire scar that I kept coming back to. I also took soil samples, and I incubated them to see who would grow. Mostly, it was Bacillus mycoides and a Brevibacterium species. Bacillus mycoides makes these long, curly, white chains on petri dishes. They look like mushroom hyphae or like fancy spider egg sacs. Brevibacteria are commonly found in soil, on human skin, and as the active color and odor-causing agent in Limburger cheese. So when I took my plates out of the incubator, the whole lab smelled like dirty feet. The lab technician reminded me that calling things stinky and gross are both value judgments. She says it's like calling a plant a weed for growing in the wrong place. Like, that stink has a lot of uses. Just because soil is dirty doesn't mean that it's gross. There's this perception of the Lachine Canal in the community that it's a really gross place and that the water is really gross. But actually, the only contaminants in the Lachine Canal, aside from when it rains too much and the sewage spills over, is the heavy metals on the bottom. Maria Della Bellicasa's 2017 book, Matters of Care, has a whole chapter about human-soil relationships. She thinks human exploitation of the living soil speaks to our need to put social reproduction at the center of our economies and love languages again. There's a lovely part of that chapter where she suggests we get to know soil by looking at it under the microscope. I guess I wanted to get to know the Lachine soil, partially because it and the waters are so stigmatized by the community. My intent at the Lachine, though, was less to catalog individuals and more to witness their growth and senescence. I knew some of them on site, but I didn't look too hard at the Linnaean names of the ones I wasn't already acquainted with. Aside from the stinky bacteria, I'm sort of wary of trying to know every plant or microorganism I meet along the canal. It feels kind of pushy. Like, you don't go into a crowded party and introduce yourself to every single person there. Mary Louise Pratt talks about the imperial eye of Euro-colonial botanists, their need to catalog and quantify the bounty of Turtle Island for exploitation. Scott, in 1998, discusses at length the European ruling class efforts to delineate, identify, catalog, and quantify individuals since the late medieval period. The canal is, of course, a Euro-colonial construction. By circumventing the Lachine Rapids, Europeans gained access to waters of the Great Lakes and could ship their wares wherever they wanted in the interior of the continent. When this was Haudenosaunee land, and Anishinaabe land, Huron-Wendat land, and early in the French settlement, this was a lake. All of the Turcotte yards in the north, all the way up to the parts of St. Henri, were covered in a marshy lake because the west flank of the mountain drains here so steeply. By turning the lake into a canal, European invaders also ordered and set the waters to what they deemed its best use. So I wanted to try and read the chaos of an ecology without trying to order it or predict it. I was hoping to achieve pure observation, seeing without trying to possess. I did it to try and slow myself down.
I first fished out of the bottom of an old aluminum canoe on a shady cove in Level Lake, New Hampshire. My grandfather would hook the worms for me, and every once in a while I would pull up a sunny. He would show me how to carefully pull the hook out of its cheek. He'd show me where the fish's fins were sharp and how to hold it so I didn't get cut. Fishing is one of those things that, in particular, gets passed down through generations. The land and the family are connected through learning. This perhaps is illustrated best through Leanne Simpson's retelling of the Nishnabeg story of Quenzin's and her discovery of maple sap. Quenzin's learning takes place in the context of family, community, and relations, Simpson explains to us. It lacks overt coercion and authority, values so normalized within mainstream Western pedagogy that they are rarely ever critiqued. The land, she goes on, Aki, is both context and process. The process of coming to know is learner-led and profoundly spiritual in nature. Coming to know is the pursuit of whole-body intelligence practiced in the context of freedom, and when realized collectively, it generates generations of loving, creative, innovative, self-determining, interdependent, and self-regulating community-minded individuals. I do not wish to appropriate this beautiful land-based learning or to suggest that my learning to fish from Level Lake and my grandfather was the same as Nishnabeg pedagogical traditions. But I do wonder how many children confined to urban classrooms are missing out on even a hint of this kind of learning. Nick learning to fish from his father and me from my grandfather wrapped practices of care into our learning. Sharing those spaces with a family member added a level of intimacy and significance to them. Weaving this intimate, brutal relationship with the fish and the ecosystem into our relationships with our family made that relationship with the ecosystem all that much more important. What's wonderful about treating the canal as the watery ecosystem it is the opportunity for multi-generational, multi-species learning and caring.
When I went back to the canal on the weekend, Another being was added to the triple of bird, water, soil. Human being. The birds were clearly less present. Humans were everywhere. In the water, on docks, on grass, hiking, walking, cycling, and fishing. It seemed that birds had retreated. The voices of the birds were fainter, and the voices of humans and their footsteps were heard everywhere, in every background.
The canal needs to be clean enough for people to eat the fish that come out of there. It came to be as a waterway that served the livelihoods of the people who lived in the area, and whether or not it was meant to, it now supports many different species, most of which we humans barely notice. As it more and more becomes a space of recreation for people with money, we lose sight of the opportunity for it to care once again for those whose livelihoods it can actually support. Giving the Lachine Canal the opportunity to care for us might encourage us to care for it and the rest of the watery local ecosystem in our own backyard. Birds, microbes, plants, and of course, fish.